Okay, so we're going to look at key issue 10.4. Why do farmers face economic difficulties? Um, Essentially, a couple different things we're going to look at: developing countries, farmers in developing countries, their problems and issues, farmers in developed countries, and then we're going to look at how to increase the world's food supply, along with different kinds of sustainable agriculture methods. So the first issue is population growth, especially in these developing countries. In order to feed the growing populations, subsistence farmers in the developing world are under a lot of pressure to increase their yields. Essentially, growing population, how are we going to feed them? Esther Bursup, she was the theorist in your guys' textbook that basically said, with innovation, there are three different ways farmers can try to help with this issue. Number one, increase land under production. Suggested of terracing irrigation. Terracing, again, over here on the right, irrigation is simply bringing water to different places that need water or didn't have water. So with irrigation, you can actually start farming areas that were once too dry or too arid to farm. New farming methods have been adopted to increase productivity. And then her third point was land left to fallow for shorter periods. Basically, the fallow means leave alone. So if you leave the land alone for shorter periods, you can grow more and more items on it more rapidly than to continue to wait. So Bursup also had these 5 stages for the fallowing, different ways to fallow. Forest fallow, you would let it go, use it for 2 years, fallow for 20. Bush fallow, use for 5 to 8 years, fallow for 10 until the undergrowth returns. Short fallow is 2 to 3 years. You would fallow for 2 years to let grasses return. Annual cropping simply means you're going to continue to use it throughout the year. However, with crop rotation, you're not using the same nutrients. You're not going to deplete the soil as fast. So if you rotate your crops, it's going to be a little bit better. Therefore, you can have plenty of food because you're always cropping that area. And then multi-cropping, essentially, you never left it fallow. As soon as it's done, you harvest it, you replant it. Harvest it, and you replant it. The second issue in developing countries is international trade. In order to increase efficiency, many technologies and seeds are needed for these countries that they just simply cannot afford because they are developing countries. To try to raise the money, a lot of the developing countries must sell export products to developed countries. What this simply means is to get money in these countries, they have to grow commercial agriculture, which is now being sold to the United States, to Europe. Therefore, they're not having enough space or areas for subsistent crops. So therefore, they have a dilemma. Do we need food to feed us here, or do we need food to sell to other countries so we can get money? So that is a big dilemma. What do we really farm? And then another part here is the food supply in Africa. Parts of Africa like the Sahel here, which is basically the border between the Sahara Desert and Sub-Saharan tropical desert. This area, Sahel here, has been growing and growing throughout the years, mainly because of desertification. These regions are usually too arid for intensive cultivation, and with little international trade means they have little money for capital investment. Therefore, it's a continuous cycle. They do not have crop. It's too arid. They can't grow a lot, so therefore they can't sell a lot. They can't sell a lot, then they can't get all this machinery and investments for people to come there and actually help develop the area. So this is a huge problem, especially when you talk about the Sahel part of Africa, and also the Horn of Africa here is also facing very similar challenges. Part of the international trade issue is how to kind of raise money. A lot of these developing countries have kind of turned to drug crops, if you will, in order to bring in foreign currency, even though this might not be legal. Some countries are kind of eager to get into the illegal crop business, mainly so they can get some sort of currency in their country. So they're not growing it just because they want to, they're growing it because it actually brings their country money, because they can actually grow this and actually get some sort of profit from the developed countries. A few of the big kind of drug crops to know is cocaine, which obviously comes from South America, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia. It does come from the coca leaf plant. The second one would be heroin. Think more Afghanistan. Actually, roughly 85 to 90% of all heroin does stem from Afghanistan. Think of the poppy plant here. And then the third one would be marijuana. Comes from the cannabis plant. And Mexico is actually the world's leading producer when it comes to marijuana from cannabis. Okay, so one issue that developed countries have is overproduction. Keep in mind, in the United States, we overproduce a lot of our foods because our farmers are so efficient. Because because the farmers are so efficient, they're going to get less and less prices for their items that they are actually producing. The U.S. government, in our case, has 3 different ways to kind of combat overproduction. All of them are through different subsidies or different ways of trying to help the farmers out to get them a certain expense or cost that they may need. First way here is encouraging or paying farmers not to grow overproduced crops. So we will pay you X amount of dollars, you just cannot grow this crop. Usually farmers turn around and then grow a different crop that year and take the money that they get from the government. The second way is to subsidize farmers when commodity prices are low. So if corn is going for $5 a bushel, but you were guaranteed $6 from the government will pay you that extra dollar for every bushel that you have sold to ensure you got that bare minimum amount that you said you were going to get. The third way they do this is buying surplus and selling and giving it to countries, especially developed countries that we in the United States donate to or sell to relatively cheaply, especially those that cannot produce their own food as well. Take a quick look here at the different crops that excuse me, that the United States does subsidize a lot. Corn being number 1, usually at the top of the list. 06 and 05 is usually, there's a lot of history there with ethanol fuel. Cotton, wheat, soybeans, and rice are the number 1 crops that we subsidize. Dairy overall as an industry we subsidize a lot, but that's not a single crop that we would subsidize. Another issue developed countries have is access to markets. This is basically the Van Thuren model that we discussed in class. Keep in mind, because shipping is a major expense, no matter what, distance to markets greatly affects what commercial farmers choose to grow. While this model does not fit perfect with today, it is still somewhat reliable when you think about what a farmer can grow, where they are located. Strongly depends on what they do grow. Keep in mind, Van Thunen developed an important model to express how proximity to markets impacts the commodities that you are produced. Quick review here, you have the city in the center here. The first ring, because of dairy being more perishable, same thing with fruits and vegetables, they're going to be relatively close. Forests, on the other hand, are going to be the second ring. Remember, we don't have a lot of forests around markets today, but the reason the forests were somewhat close was because they needed fuel, and it was very costly to transport the forest, or not the forest, excuse me, the different trees to the market center. The third ring is going to be grains and field crops. This is a little more extensive farming. It's going to be cheaper rent out here. Okay, so they need more area, so they need the cheaper rent. And then livestock and ranching, because you can actually back in the day actually have the cattle be walked to the market or led to the market. You didn't need to be as close because travel expenses weren't as costly, and you also need a lot more area for the livestock and ranch type farm, so it's going to be more extensive. So keep in mind, the outside here is going to be the wilderness or the additional 5th ring, where it is just simply too far away from market to actually be profitable for a farmer to grow food. The second thing here is physical features do impact Van Thunen's model. If you were to bring a river into this, that might change everything in the proximity, because you might want more forest near there, because you can actually send the forest or the timber, if you will, down the river. So as soon as you have any kind of major physical feature in the middle here, that is going to throw off the entire model. Not to mention that you might have other urban areas in that model, but if you're simply looking at one urban area, as soon as you have a physical feature like a river, it changes the entire dynamic of the model. Strategy that the book provides that tries to help increase food supply around the world is simply increasing exports from surplus countries. Note down here you have a lot of Western countries, Brazil, Argentina, United States. The Western side of the world generally has a lot more surplus and will then send it to other countries that do not have a huge surplus. Basically, an equitable and expanded system of distribution could tackle this issue. So if we do send more out here to these countries, it could actually help spread more food around the world. But it's interesting to note that even in Europe, they don't have a high surplus, but in the United States, North America, and South America, we have a great surplus of food that could be shipped around the world. That is possible one strategy to kind of combat feed in the world. Keep in mind, another strategy we have is increasing land under production. Basically, you're going to try to find more land that would not be suitable for agriculture, but now turning it into agriculture. With more land, obviously you can have more food being grown, which will expand the agricultural land. However, this does pose problems. Keep in mind right here, you have a lot of sandy area here, sandy soil that is basically going to need to be irrigated. That's why there's the circular patterns here, because that's how the irrigation system works. Here you can see that they're actually just simply farming in the middle of a desert. If you irrigate it enough, if you bring in enough other soil, you now have more land that you can actually farm upon. Another issue is growing urban centers consume actual prime agricultural land. Most urban centers in the world are not just created in the middle of a desert like Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Many big urban areas, because they were so fertile back in the day, have been the city centers for thousands upon thousands of years, and now you have a lot of people living in those areas. If you have a lot of people living there, you can't use that for agriculture, which is kind of some of the best land in the world we do not use for agriculture. You can see this does not always work. One example is the Aral Sea. A lot of the tributaries to the sea here were actually used for irrigation, so all the farmers used all the water that was filling up this sea. Now today you can see, because all of that tributaries that go along with that sea are now washed away, it has now washed or basically evaporated the entire lake there. So that's a huge problem in a lot of areas. So you're using the water to farm or to irrigate all the crops, but at the same time you're using up your water supply, which is very, very valuable, especially to farming communities. Another idea that is always brought up as a strategy is expanding fishing. 70% of the world is covered by ocean, so essentially we should have an endless supply of fish, or at least that's the theory that they kind of come up with this. The expansion of fishing was simply one way to increase food supply in the world without depending on simply land-based farming, because we don't have as much land. Therefore, we should conserve it a little bit more, and this would solve that in one way. Fish consumption has risen dramatically in the last few decades, usually going from about 27 million metric tons in 1960 to 110 million in 2010. However, at the same time, fish production has increased even more sharply, from 36 to 145 million metric tons. This extra production of fish does not simply go to humans to consume. A lot of it goes to animal feed on land, chicken, beef, any other kind of livestock on land. So the expansion of fishing, if you will, or fish around the world, or seafood, is through the system of aquaculture, which is simply farming of fish. So you're farming the fish. They're not wild. They're either in controlled environments, or there might even be on land in tanks, so they're farmed fish, if you will. This has expanded really fast over the last few decades. Part of the reason because of this is because of overfishing has depleted a lot of types of fish in certain areas. One big one is cod. That's kind of the primary cod, or primary fish many people eat on Friday fish fries, if you will. Has become pretty popular throughout the United States. Thus, there's a lot of overfishing of cod in the United States. The world has been overfished. The UN even estimates that 1/4 of all fish stocks are already overfished and half are fully exploited, including most of the most desirable stocks here. So this should give you kind of a good idea of basically how much are we fishing, are we overfishing, and the answer, according to this chart, is there is a lot of overfishing going on. So the third strategy they have is increasing productivity. How can we simply get more out of what we're already doing? Because the global famine that Neil Malthuson's kind of predicted never actually occurred, tremendous advances in the mid-1900s led to an expansion of agricultural productivity. So they thought all these people were coming. They were very innovative in what they were doing, and then they realized the crisis really didn't occur. They were able to keep up with the population, and now they were increasing actually too much. This era of innovation was the third agricultural revolution, or simply the green revolution, if you will. Technologies like the combine were combined with scientific advances like genetically modified seeds and improved fertilizer. This made agriculture vastly more productive. It did so, however, at a lot of cost, especially environmentally and socially. There was a lot of downside to this green revolution. Some problems with the green revolution that you want to take note of: health problems. High rates of genetically modified seed consumption may reduce antibiotic effectiveness, and also diversity of local crops may be lost to a focus on exporting crops. So instead of having subsistence crops that are very diverse for yourselves, you might be losing some of these because simply all you're growing is stuff that's going to be exported out of the country. Now, some problems with exporting for them in some regions like the Eurozone, they have really strict limits in the European Union when it comes to genetically modified crops. So all these developing countries that are kind of moving towards this, if they try selling them to Europeans, they may not be able to. It might be outlawed for them to actually sell that to people in Europe. So that's one group of people they cannot actually sell all of their crops to. And the third one, it provides more dependence on the United States by these developing countries. The whole point is to get them to be dependent on their own, not need our technology. But essentially, with a lot of our companies, especially Monsanto, you have kind of these terminator genes, which they can't keep the seeds every year to the next year to the next year. Essentially, they have an expiration date on them where they actually have to go and buy new seeds from these companies, so they become more and more dependent on the United States. And the final topic in key issue 4 here is sustainable agriculture. This essentially means practices that preserve and enhance environmental quality, keeping with the environment in mind the entire time that you are farming. One obvious way we discussed before in class is the organic farming. Is kind of the most popular form of sustainable agriculture. Basically, it looks down and it kind of stays away from chemicals and fertilizers being applied not only to the crops, but to the soil that it is actually grown in. Only 0.6% of all worldwide commercial agriculture is organic. That's a very, very small amount. However, it is highly concentrated in Australia and Argentina. So Australia makes up 32% of all organics in the world, and Argentina surprisingly makes up 12%. There are 3 primary ways in which sustainable agriculture is achieved. One is sensitive land management, basically using the land in ways that maximize sustainability. One idea of this is land tillage. Simply when a tractor goes through, tills it up, you're actually growing the new crops into the stuff that is already tilled. This preserves more topsoil. Instead of retilling, you keep that same tillage on top and you just grow it on that tillage. The second way is limited to no use of chemicals. Pretty common with this comes to organic. This is what you want to think about. Not using those chemicals. Try to avoid getting them on your crops and then also on the earth around it, because it might dry it out. It might make the oil unnutritious for the crops that are being grown there. And then the third way is responsibility of integrated crop and livestock. This essentially attempts to make farming self-sustaining as possible. So instead of having cows caged up and chickens caged up, you have free-range cows, free-range chickens, cage-free, grass-fed, more natural, and not as abusive to the environment. So instead of having all these cows in a small area and then next to them having more cows in that small area, you just have that normal set of cows kind of more spread out, more free roaming.